They laughed when she handed him the map. By sunrise, no one in that town dared say his name. The wind rolled low across Dust Hollow, carrying the dry scent of sunburnt wood and horse sweat through the crooked street where boots had worn the dirt flat over years of quiet judgment. Ethan Cole stood near the hitching post outside Mercer's General Store, one hand resting loosely on the worn leather of his saddle, watching without appearing to watch, the way men out here learned to do if they wanted to live long enough to grow old. The girl stood at the edge of town like she didn't belong to it, and maybe she didn't. Dark hair caught the last light of evening, her dress marked by travel and dust, her posture straight in a way that didn't ask for permission. No one greeted her. No one stepped aside. They just stared, the kind of stare that didn't need words to say what it meant. Someone chuckled. Then another. Low, careless. Ayanna didn't flinch. She simply walked forward, each step measured, like she knew exactly how far she was allowed to go before the town pushed back. Ethan noticed that. He noticed everything. The way her eyes moved, not fast, not nervous, but aware. The way her hands stayed visible. The way silence followed her like something heavier than fear. Lost? A man called from the porch, voice thick with something between amusement and warning. She didn't answer. Instead, she stopped a few feet short of Ethan, close enough that he could see the fine layer of dust on her skin, the faint mark of something like ash on her sleeve. Up close, her eyes held something steady, something that didn't match the laughter around them. She reached into the fold of her dress slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small roll of worn leather, tied with a thin strip. No sudden movements. No hesitation. She held it out to him. Not to the crowd. Not to anyone else. Just him. The laughter grew louder behind them. Careful, Cole, someone said. Might be trading trouble for free. Ethan didn't move right away. The leather looked old. Not fragile, weathered. Like it had seen more miles than most men ever would. The strip binding it was tight, knotted with care, not haste. He glanced at her again. She wasn't pleading. Wasn't offering. She was choosing. That was different. Slowly he took it. The leather felt warm, like it had been held for a long time. He didn't open it. Not yet. The air shifted. Not in the way storms do, but quieter. Like something had just settled into place. Why him? Another voice muttered. Ayanna didn't answer them. She spoke only once, her voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach Ethan and no one else. Don't follow the ones who smile. Then she stepped back. No hesitation. No explanation. She turned and walked out the way she came, leaving the town to its dust and its laughter that didn't quite sound the same anymore. Ethan stood there a moment longer, the weight of the map resting in his hand, heavier than it should have been for something so small. He could feel eyes on him now, not curious anymore. Measuring. He tucked the leather into his coat without a word, swung into the saddle with a quiet motion, and rode out before the sun had fully dropped behind the hills. By the time the first lanterns lit along the street, one of the men who had laughed the loudest was nowhere to be found. By midnight, 2 more were gone. No struggle, no sound, just absence. And somewhere beyond the reach of Dust Hollow, beneath a sky stretched wide and indifferent, Ethan Cole rode with a map he hadn't yet opened, already knowing, some things don't lead you to a place, they lead you to a truth no one else wants found. The night stretched long and thin across the desert, the kind of night that made every sound carry farther than it should, and every silence feel like it was watching. Ethan Cole rode without hurry, his horse keeping a steady pace over the hard-packed earth as the last glow of Dust Hollow disappeared behind him. He did not look back. Men who looked back too often tended to find something following them. The leather map sat inside his coat, pressed against his chest, warm from his body, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with size. He could feel it there with every breath, like a quiet reminder that something had already begun whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. The desert opened wide ahead, pale under the rising moon, dotted with low brush and the occasional twisted tree that had survived more seasons than most men could count. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, its voice thin and echoing, and Ethan's horse flicked an ear but did not break stride. After about 2 miles, he slowed near a shallow ridge where the land dipped just enough to hide a man and his fire from casual eyes. He dismounted in one smooth motion, boots settling into the dust with a soft crunch, and tied the reins loosely to a scrub branch. No rush, no wasted movement. That was how he had lived for years now. He crouched beside a small circle of stones, struck a match, and coaxed a low flame to life. Just enough to see by, not enough to be seen from a distance. The smell of smoke rose slow and clean, mixing with the dry scent of sage and leather. For a long moment, he did nothing but sit there, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire like he was waiting for it to speak first. Then, finally, he reached inside his coat and pulled out the map. The leather unfolded with a soft creak, edges worn smooth by time. The surface marked with lines that were not drawn in any way he had seen before. No clean grids. No official markings. Just curves and symbols that looked more like memory than direction. He turned it slightly toward the firelight, studying the way the shadows moved across it, revealing details only when the flame shifted. A line here, faint but deliberate. A cluster of marks that could have been stones or graves or something else entirely. And there, near the edge, a single symbol repeated twice, like a warning or a promise. Ethan narrowed his eyes. He had seen maps before. Plenty. Ranch boundaries, cattle routes, supply trails. This was none of those. This was something meant for someone who already knew what they were looking for. Not for strangers, he muttered under his breath, the words barely leaving his lips. The horse shifted behind him, hooves brushing the ground, and Ethan glanced up just enough to listen. The night answered back with nothing unusual. No extra rhythm. No second set of steps. Still, he did not relax. He folded the map halfway, then paused. There, caught between two layers of leather, something thin slid loose and dropped into his palm. Hey, second piece. Smaller. Lighter. He held it up to the fire. It was not a map. Not exactly. More like a fragment. A single line etched deeper than the others, ending in a mark that looked almost like a doorway or an opening carved into stone. He turned it, then held it over the larger map, and for a brief second, the lines aligned. Not perfectly, not obviously, but enough. Enough to know they belonged together. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes he has already gone too far to pretend this is nothing. Somewhere behind him, far off, but not far enough, a faint sound broke the stillness. Not loud, not careless, just a single shift of gravel under weight that did not belong to him. Ethan did not turn. He did not reach for his gun. He simply lowered the smaller piece back onto the larger map, covered both with his hand, and stared into the fire as if nothing had changed at all. Because out here, the moment you showed that you heard something was the moment you gave it power. And whatever had begun back in that town was no longer behind him. It had followed, quiet as breath, patient as the desert itself. The fire burned lower, shrinking into a bed of red coals that pulsed like a slow heartbeat against the dark, and Ethan Cole sat as still as the stones around him, his hand resting lightly over the folded leather as if it were nothing more than a scrap of cloth instead of something that had already begun to change the shape of his night. The sound did not come again right away. That was the first thing he noticed. Whoever had made it understood patience, understood distance, understood that the difference between being seen and being forgotten was often no more than a single careless step. Ethan reached for a small stick and nudged the coals, sending a brief flare of orange light upward, enough to cast shadows across the ridge, and then let them fall again. In that flicker, he let his eyes move just enough to read the edges of the world around him without turning his head. The brush to the east sat untouched. The ridge behind him held its shape. The horse stood quiet, ears forward, not alarmed, but listening. That told him more than anything else. If the animal was not afraid, then whatever followed was not rushing, not hunting, just staying close. He picked up his tin cup, took a slow drink of water, and set it down with the same deliberate care. No sudden moves, no signal that anything had changed. The map remained under his palm, but his attention shifted inward now, replaying the moment the second piece had slipped free. That had not been an accident. Nothing about this felt accidental. He slid his fingers beneath the leather again, not lifting it fully, just enough to feel the edge of the smaller fragment still aligned against the larger one. The lines matched in a way that was not meant to be obvious. You had to look for it. You had to want to see it. That meant Ayana had not given this to just anyone. She had chosen him for a reason she had not spoken. The thoughts settled heavy, not like a burden, but like a question that would not leave. Why him? Ethan exhaled slowly, then leaned forward and let a small handful of dirt fall over the coals, dimming the light even further until the fire became little more than a faint glow. Darkness filled in around him, thick and steady, but not empty. Never empty. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time had a way of stretching when a man chose to wait instead of act. Then, finally, there it was again. Softer this time. A shift of weight. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to remind him he was not alone. Ethan's gaze stayed on the ground in front of him, but his voice broke the silence, low and even, carried just far enough. "You can keep following," he said, not raising his head, not tightening his grip, "but you are already too late." The words hung there, simple, without threat, without challenge. Just truth, or at least something close enough to it to make a man think. No answer came. That was expected. Men who followed in silence rarely wasted words. But something changed. Not in sound. In feeling. The kind of shift you notice in the air before a storm you cannot yet see. Ethan waited a moment longer, then moved at last, slow and unhurried, folding the map and the fragment together with care, tucking them back inside his coat as if he had all the time in the world. He rose to his feet, brushed the dust from his hands, and untied the reins. The horse stepped forward easily, trusting the movement without question. Ethan swung into the saddle and turned not toward the open desert ahead, but slightly off course, angling toward a narrow line of darker land where the ground dipped and twisted between low stone formations. Not the easiest path, not the fastest, but not the one someone would expect if they thought he was following the map as it appeared. As he rode, the night seemed to shift with him, the distance behind stretching, bending, swallowing sound in ways that made it harder to track a single rider. He did not look back. He did not need to. Because out here, the man who looks back is the one who is unsure. And Ethan Cole was beginning to understand something the map had not yet shown him. It was not about where it led. It was about who else believed they knew. The land narrowed as Ethan Cole guided his horse into the darker stretch of broken ground, where low stone walls rose like the backs of sleeping animals, and the wind moved differently, quieter, as if it had learned to pass through without being noticed. Hooves struck rock instead of dust now, each step sharper, but shorter, controlled. Ethan let the reins hang loose, trusting the horse to find its footing, his own attention shifting between the ground ahead and the silence behind. The follower had not closed the distance. That told him something. Not hesitation, not fear. Discipline. Whoever it was knew this terrain, or at least knew how to wait until it became useful. The kind of patience that did not come cheap. Ethan reached into his coat as he rode, pulling the map free again, but this time he did not unfold it fully. Instead, he slid out the smaller fragment and held it closer to the faint moonlight. The deeper line etched into it caught just enough light to reveal something he had missed before. Not a straight path. A bend. Subtle, almost hidden, like a detour someone would only take if they already understood what the main trail concealed. He turned the piece slightly, then looked up at the land around him. The narrow passage he had chosen matched that curve, not perfectly, but close enough to feel intentional. Ayana had not given him directions. She had given him a way to read what others would overlook. Ethan let out a slow breath, then folded the fragment back and pressed both pieces together before tucking them away. He did not need to see them anymore. Not yet. The terrain dipped again, opening into a shallow basin no more than 50 yards across, ringed by stone and shadow. The kind of place where sound settled instead of carrying. Ethan slowed, then brought the horse to a stop near the center. He listened. No wind. No distant call. Just stillness. He slid down from the saddle, boots meeting the ground with a dull thud, and walked a few steps forward, scanning the edges of the basin without turning his head too quickly. Then he did something different. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of cloth, worn and plain, and tied it loosely to a low branch near the center of the basin. Not hidden, not obvious, just there. A marker, but not for himself. He returned to the horse, mounted again, and rode on without looking back, angling toward a narrow exit on the far side that curved sharply to the left, following the shape he had seen in the fragment. The movement was deliberate now, not just travel, a decision. Behind him, the cloth shifted slightly in the still air, catching what little light remained. A sign left behind for someone who thought they were the one doing the tracking. Ethan rode another quarter-mile before slowing again, guiding the horse behind a jut of stone that rose higher than the rest, its shadow deep enough to swallow both man and animal. He dismounted once more, but this time he did not make a fire. He did not sit. He stood with one hand resting lightly against the rock, listening to the land the way a man listens to a story he has heard before but never quite understood. Time passed. Then, faint but clear, the sound came again. Not from behind this time. From the basin. A pause. Then a second shift. Closer together now. Not rushing. Not careless. Just enough to confirm what Ethan had already begun to suspect. They were following the path he had left, not the one he had taken. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, not in triumph, but in recognition. The map was not leading him somewhere. It was showing him who else believed they knew the way. Ethan opened his eyes again, mounted the horse in one smooth motion, and guided it forward into the deeper dark, leaving the basin, the cloth, and the unseen presence behind to follow something that was never meant to be found. And somewhere in the quiet between those choices, the distance between hunter and follower began to change in a way neither of them had fully understood yet. By the time the first hint of dawn began to press against the horizon, the desert had changed its color but not its silence, and Ethan Cole rode through it like a man who had already accepted that whatever lay ahead was not waiting for him, but had been waiting long before he ever held that map. The air turned cooler for a brief hour, carrying a faint trace of something unfamiliar, not smoke, not water, but something older, like stone that had not seen the sun in years. Ethan slowed his horse as the land opened again, wider this time, but flatter, the ground smoother than it should have been for a place this far from any trail. No wagon tracks, no scattered debris, just a quiet stretch of earth that looked untouched and yet felt used. He dismounted without thinking, boots settling into the fine dust that did not rise as easily as it should. That was the first sign. He crouched slightly, brushing his fingers across the surface. The top layer shifted, but beneath it, the ground felt packed, firm, as if it had been pressed down long ago and left that way on purpose. Ethan straightened slowly, eyes moving across the open space. About 30 yards ahead, a line of stone sat half buried, not placed neatly, not arranged for show, but positioned in a way that felt deliberate. Too evenly spaced to be natural. Too quiet to be noticed unless you were looking for something that did not want to be seen. He stepped forward, each movement measured, the map still tucked inside his coat, but present in his mind now more clearly than before. He did not need to unfold it. The fragment had already shown him this bend, this opening, this absence of noise. When he reached the stones, he stopped. There were no markings, no carvings, just smooth surfaces worn by time. But as he stood there, something shifted in the light. The rising sun caught the edge of one stone at an angle, revealing a faint line carved so shallow it disappeared unless the light struck it just right. Ethan leaned closer. It was not a word, not a symbol he recognized, just a line, angled downward, matching the same direction as the deeper mark on the fragment. He moved to the next stone. Another line, same angle, different length. A pattern, but not one meant to be read quickly. A pattern meant to be understood only if you already knew what it pointed toward. Ethan stepped back, letting his eyes take in the full line of stones now, not as separate pieces, but as part of something larger. They formed a path, but not one you walked. One you saw. One that led beyond the visible, beyond the ground itself. He turned slightly, following the direction those lines suggested, and that was when he saw it. Not far, maybe 50 yards past the stones, where the ground dipped just enough to hide what lay beyond. A shadow that did not belong to any rock or ridge. A darkness that held its shape even as the sun climbed higher. Ethan did not move right away. He stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle, not heavy, not urgent, but certain. This was not a place someone stumbled upon. This was a place someone was meant to arrive at only after everything else had already been decided. Behind him, far off now, the desert remained quiet. No immediate sound of pursuit. No sign of the ones who had followed his false trail. But Ethan did not mistake silence for safety. He knew better than that. He reached into his coat, finally pulling the map free again, unfolding it just enough to compare the lines etched in leather to the ones carved in stone. They matched, not in detail, but in intention. The same curve. The same direction. The same quiet insistence that what mattered was not the path itself, but what it revealed when you stopped trying to follow it like a road. Ethan folded the map again, slower this time, as if the act itself carried meaning. Now, then he looked back toward the shadowed dip in the land, the place where the light did not fully reach. He exhaled once, steady, and began to walk, leaving the horse where it stood, because some places were not meant to be entered with anything but your own weight and your own choice. And as he moved closer, the air changed again, cooler, stiller, carrying that same faint scent of stone and something else beneath it, something that felt less like the past and more like something waiting to be remembered. The ground sloped downward just enough that the light hesitated before following, and Ethan Cole felt the change before he fully saw it, the way a man feels cold water through his boots before he looks down and notices the river. Each step carried him closer to that hollow in the land where the sun seemed to lose its reach, and the air grew still in a way that did not belong to open country. No wind moved here. No insect stirred. Even the distant sounds of the desert seemed to stop at the edge, as if something unseen had drawn a line and told the world to wait. Ethan slowed, not from fear, but from understanding. Places like this did not need to hide. They were hidden by the way people chose not to see them. He stepped past the last ridge of light and into the shadow, and the temperature dropped just enough to notice, a quiet cool that settled against his skin like a memory rather than a warning. The ground beneath his boots changed too, from loose dust to something firmer, smoother, as if it had been walked before, many times, but not recently. He did not look around too quickly. Instead, he let his eyes adjust, letting shapes form slowly out of the dimness. At first, there was nothing, just stone and shadow. Then, as the light shifted behind him, details began to rise from the quiet. Flat surfaces where there should have been rough ground. Subtle edges where nature rarely drew straight lines. And then, further in, a series of low shapes pressed into the earth, not raised, not marked with any name, just present. Ethan stopped. He did not step closer right away. He simply stood there, letting the stillness speak in the only way it knew how. This was not a place of accident. This was not a place forgotten by time. It was a place that had been left behind on purpose. He took one step forward, then another, until he stood at the edge of those low shapes. They were not large, no more than a few feet across, some barely visible unless the light caught them at the right angle. He crouched slightly, brushing his fingers across the surface of one. The ground held firm beneath his touch, packed in a way that told a quiet story without words. Not fresh, not disturbed, just kept. Ethan's gaze moved across them, counting without meaning to. 1, 3, 7. More beyond, fading into shadow. No markers, no signs, no names carved into stone. Just a line of presence that stretched deeper than the eye could follow. He reached into his coat again, pulling out the map, unfolding it just enough to compare what he saw to what had been given. The lines matched in a way that no longer surprised him. The curve, the placement, the way the deeper mark on the fragment pointed not to a destination, but to a realization. This was what the map had been showing him all along. Not where to go, but what had been left behind when people stopped looking. Ethan lowered the map slowly, folding it with care, his movements quieter now, as if the air itself asked for less. He stood again, eyes moving across the silent ground, and for the first time since leaving Dust Hollow, something in his posture shifted. Not tension, not readiness, something else. Recognition, the kind that does not come from knowledge, but from understanding too late that something should have been known all along. Ayana had not given him a path to follow. She had given him a truth to carry. And truth, out here, did not need to be spoken to be felt. Behind him, far beyond the ridge, the desert remained unchanged, wide and open, holding its distance like it always had. But here, in this quiet hollow where the light hesitated, something else remained. Not danger, not threat, just the weight of something that had been covered, not buried, waiting for someone who would not turn away when they finally saw it. Ethan took one more slow breath, then stepped deeper into the shadow, not searching, not uncovering, just moving forward. With the understanding that some places do not ask for action, they ask for witness. And as he stood there, surrounded by a silence that felt older than the land itself, He realized that whatever had followed him would not understand what this place meant. Because this was not something you could take. This was something you had to accept or leave behind forever. The silence did not break when Ethan Cole moved, but it shifted, the way a held breath changes when someone finally decides to speak. And that was when he felt it, not behind him this time, not distant, but closer, just beyond the edge of the hollow where the light still reached. He did not turn right away. He let the moment settle, let the presence reveal itself in its own time, because whatever had followed him this far had already chosen to step into a place that did not belong to it. That meant something. Ethan slowly straightened, his hands resting at his sides, his posture calm, almost still, as if he were just another part of the land. Then the sound came, not a misstep, not a slip, but a deliberate footfall against stone, careful but no longer hidden. One, then another. He turned his head just enough to see the edge of the shadow where it met the morning light, and a figure stood there, outlined but not yet fully revealed, as if the land itself had not decided whether to accept or reject him. The man did not move forward immediately. He stood at the boundary, looking in, the same way Ethan had looked only minutes before. That told Ethan everything he needed to know. This was not a man who understood this place. This was a man who believed he did. "You found it," the voice said, low, controlled, carrying across the hollow without echo, as if even sound chose to move carefully here. Ethan did not answer. He did not step back. He simply watched, his eyes steady, his silence not empty, but full of something the other man could not quite read. The figure took one step forward, then another, crossing into the shadow, and for a brief second, the light caught his face. Dust Hollow. One of them. Not the loudest voice, not the first to laugh, but present, watching, remembering. "We knew it was real," the man continued, his gaze moving past Ethan now, settling on the low shapes in the ground, the quiet line of something he had not expected to see so clearly. His tone changed, just slightly. Not fear, not respect, something closer to confusion. "All these years, right under us." Ethan finally spoke, his voice as even as the ground beneath them. "Not under you." The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that does not need explanation to be understood. The man frowned, just barely, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether he had been corrected or challenged. He took another step, his boots pressing into the firm earth, leaving marks where none had been moments before. "That map," he said, shifting his attention back to Ethan. "It leads here. That means it belongs to whoever holds it." Ethan's gaze did not change. "You think this is something you can own?" Not a question. The man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then straightened slightly, as if reminding himself of something he believed. "Everything out here belongs to someone," he replied. "You just have to be the one willing to claim it." The hollow seemed to absorb the words, not rejecting them, not accepting them, just letting them settle like dust that would never quite stay still. Ethan glanced down briefly at the ground, then back at the man. "You followed the wrong thing." The man's jaw tightened. "I followed you." "No," Ethan said quietly. "You followed what you thought I had." That was when the difference became clear, not in sound, not in movement, but in understanding. The man looked around again, this time slower, his eyes tracing the line of the low shapes, the quiet order of something that did not ask to be disturbed, and for the first time, uncertainty slipped into his posture. Not enough to change his stance, but enough to shift his weight. "So what is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the silence return, let the hollow speak in the only way it could, through absence, through stillness, through the weight of something that did not need to be named. Then he reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the map. The leather caught the faint light, worn edges soft against his fingers. He held it. For a moment, not offering it, not hiding it, just letting it exist between them. "It is not a map," he said finally. "It is a choice." The man's eyes fixed on it, drawn not by greed alone, but by the need to understand what he had followed all this way. "Then make it," he said. Ethan looked at him, really looked this time, not at the man, but at what stood behind his eyes, the belief that everything had a price, a claim, a name that could be written down and kept. Then Ethan folded the map slowly, the movement calm, unhurried, and slipped it back inside his coat. Already did. The words settled into the hollow, and this time, even the silence felt different, like something had shifted that could not be undone. The man did not speak again right away, and for a moment the hollow held both of them in the same quiet, but not in the same understanding, because one of them stood there looking for something to take, and the other stood there knowing there was nothing left to claim. The light shifted higher behind the ridge, pressing further into the shadow, and the outlines of the low shapes in the ground became clearer, not louder, not sharper, just more present, like something that had decided it was time to be seen without asking permission. The man's gaze moved across them again, slower now, his shoulders no longer as certain as they had been when he first stepped in. "So that is it?" he said finally, his voice lower, not challenging anymore, but searching for something he could still hold on to. "This is what she gave you." Ethan did not answer the question the way it was asked. He took a step to the side instead, not toward the man, not away, just enough to change the angle of the light across the ground between them. "Look again," he said quietly. The man frowned, but he did as he was told, shifting his position slightly, and as he moved, the light caught the ground differently, revealing something that had been there the entire time but had not yet been noticed. The lines in the earth were not random. They were not just shapes pressed into dirt. They formed a pattern, subtle, almost invisible unless you stopped looking for something obvious. A curve, a direction, the same curve that had been etched into the leather, the same direction that had led Ethan here. The man's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that something inside him had begun to move. "It is not just this place," he said slowly, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod. "No." The man took another step, then stopped, his boots hovering just above one of the low shapes, hesitating for the first time since he arrived. "It is all of it." Ethan's eyes remained steady. It always was. The words settled into the space between them, and this time, they did not feel like a challenge or a correction. They felt like an answer that had been waiting longer than either of them had known how to ask the question. The man looked down again, then out toward the edge of the hollow, where the light met the shadow, and stopped. His posture shifted again, not weaker, not smaller, just different, like a man realizing that the ground beneath his feet was not what he had believed it to be. "They built the town over this," he said, his voice quieter now. Not accusing, not denying, just stating something that had finally come into focus. Ethan did not confirm it. He did not need to. Some truths do not require agreement to exist. The man exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck, the gesture unguarded now, almost human in a way it had not been before. "All this time," he said, barely above a whisper, "we thought it was just land." Ethan turned his gaze briefly toward the far side of the hollow, where the stone line began and the desert stretched beyond it. It was never just land. The silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of something that neither of them could take with them the way they had come. The man stood there a moment longer, then stepped back, slowly, carefully, as if the act of leaving required more attention than arriving had. He did not look at Ethan when he spoke again. "What happens now?" Ethan considered the question, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood that the answer did not belong to him alone. He looked down once more at the quiet shapes in the ground, then back toward the edge of the hollow where the light waited. "That depends," he said, his voice steady, "on what you choose to remember." The man nodded faintly, not in agreement, not in defiance, just in acknowledgement of something he could no longer ignore. Then he turned and walked back toward the light, each step slower than the one before, as if the weight of what he carried now had nothing to do with what he had come here for. Ethan remained where he was, unmoving, watching the boundary between shadow and sun, and as the man crossed it and disappeared into the open desert beyond, the hollow grew quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This time, it felt like something had been understood, not spoken, not claimed, just accepted in the only way that mattered out here, without witnesses, without proof, and without the need for either. The hollow remained still long after the man disappeared into the light, and Ethan Cole did not move right away, because some moments out here were not meant to be followed by action, only understood in silence. The air held steady, cool, and unmoving, as if the land itself had no need to rush what had already been decided. Ethan stood among the low shapes, his gaze drifting across them one last time, not counting, not searching, just seeing. The map rested inside his coat, but it no longer felt like something he needed to carry. It had already done its work. Slowly, he reached inside and pulled it free, the worn leather folding open in his hands with that same quiet sound it had made the night before. The lines were still there. The curve, the marks, the suggestion of direction. But now, standing where it had always been pointing, the map looked different. Not wrong, just finished. Ethan held it for a moment longer, letting the light from the rising sun catch its surface, revealing the same details that had once felt like answers. Then he stepped back toward the edge of the hollow, where the shadow thinned and the warmth of the morning began to return. He paused there, just at the boundary, and looked down at the leather one last time. A tool, a guide, a question. And now, none of those things mattered the same way. Without ceremony, without hesitation, he struck a small match against the sole of his boot. The flame caught quickly, small and bright against the still air. He held it to the edge of the map. The leather resisted for a second, then darkened, then began to curl as the fire took hold, slow and steady, consuming not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. Ethan watched it burn, not rushing the moment, not turning away. The lines faded first, then the edges, then the shape itself, until all that remained was a thin trail of smoke rising into the morning light and disappearing into a sky that did not keep what it was given. When the last of it fell to ash, he let it drop from his fingers and scatter across the ground, where it blended with the dust as if it had always belonged there. He did not look back at it again. Instead, he stepped fully into the sunlight, the warmth settling across his shoulders as he walked back toward where his horse waited beyond the ridge. The animal lifted its head as he approached, calm, patient, as if nothing unusual had passed. Ethan ran a hand along its neck, a quiet gesture, then swung into the saddle with the same steady motion he had used 100 times before. But something had changed, not in the way he moved, in the reason he moved at all. He turned the horse toward the open desert, away from the hollow, away from the stones, away from the place that would remain whether anyone spoke of it or not. As he rode, the land stretched out before him, wide and familiar, carrying the same wind, the same dust, the same long lines of distance that defined everything out here. But now, it felt different. Not new, just clearer. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher and the road back toward Dust Hollow came into view, Ethan slowed. The town sat where it always had, quiet from a distance, its buildings catching the light in a way that made them look almost unchanged. But Ethan knew better. Places do not change because the land shifts. They change because someone finally sees what has been there all along. He did not ride straight in. Instead, he stopped at the edge, watching the town the way he had watched the hollow. Not judging, not deciding, just understanding. Few figures moved along the main street, slower than before, quieter. No laughter carried on the wind this time. No careless voices calling out. Just movement. Measured. Aware. Ethan tipped his hat slightly, not to anyone in particular, but to the place itself, then turned his horse away from the road and continued past it, choosing distance over return. Behind him, Dust Hollow remained, sitting on its quiet ground, holding its own truths in the same way the hollow had. And somewhere far beyond sight, a girl with steady eyes had given a map not to show a path, but to reveal what could not be unseen. Out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It settled in slowly, like dust in the morning light, until even the ones who had never gone looking for it could no longer pretend it was not there.